Awesome. Hi, I'm Ralf. Just Ralf is fine. That stuff. And yeah, thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Justin, what do I need to get a 7 for this?
Yeah.
Stay on time. Yeah. Okay. Got it. Don't block people from a drink. I'm going to start you off with a quick puzzle. If you like kind of those puzzles, right? So given a string mi, so the two letters mi, there's 4 rules. The question is, can you produce a string mu, right? So you can add a u to anything that ends in an I. You can double anything that follows an m. So mui can be muiui. If you've got 3 i's, you can replace it with a u, and if you've got 2 u's, you can drop it. So you can kind of think about that for a minute, burn it into your brain. You don't have a physical copy, so you just got to remember it. I'm seeing a mixed bunch of faces, which is perfect, because I'll talk about that in a moment. And it's from a book called Göttliche Bach by Douglas Hofstadter. If you haven't read it, don't worry, most people haven't. It's thick, but it's one of those things everybody recommends it. It's a great book, and it is a great book. Most people don't get through it. You can probably see why. So, who am I? I've got a game studio called Audacious, or I just refer to it as a studio. We do education work, we do development work, we do games work. I used to be head of the Multimedia and Interaction Design degree program at UQ a very long time ago. I was head of games design and animation at SAE there for a while, and lectured at University of Canberra, some game design lecturing there. My PhD's in distributed systems, integration. Effectively, my interest is in how the resonances and dissonances between the different mental models that we make of the world impact technology design and deployment. Or to put it another way, how do we see the world in different ways? And how does the fact that we see the world in different ways, like, what does it matter? What do we do with that? I'm also really passionate about transformational learning. And all these things are the same thing. I hope I'll take you there in a moment. But we're actually here to talk about games, obviously. It's the Experimental Games Conference. Games, it's a big thing. But again, if we drill down a bit, like, what are games, right? Games are toys with rules, toys with an end goal. There's a target. And why are games and toys so engaging, so cool for us? Because they let us play. So it was totally a rhetorical question, obviously, so I answered it immediately. Right? They let us play. And why is that important? Like, why do we like to play? And you're all here at an Experimental Games Conference, so it's probably a question you should have thought about at least once if you're going to go into this industry. And in fact, neuroscience actually kind of tells you some of that. Because neuroscience says there's this really bog standard reverse U curve, where we've got pleasure on one axis, we've got familiarity on the other axis. If we see stuff that's totally unfamiliar, we get very little joy out of it, because it doesn't make any sense. So for some people, when I put that puzzle up, they're like, I could see that it was in the very unfamiliar, not a lot of pleasure happening there. If you're in the completely familiar level, stuff's just boring, right? So if you've read Göttliche Bach and you're familiar with that Mu puzzle, or if you've been in one of my classes where I taught that, Jared might even remember, I might have had that in a class many, many years ago, you'd be like, yeah, no, I know the answer to that, so I'm not going to engage you whatsoever. But the sweet spot at the top is where neuroscience says, we aim for this sweet spot of familiarity, somewhere between completely unfamiliar and really familiar. And the problem is, familiarity is a moving target. When you encounter something, it's unfamiliar. And if you stay with it, it becomes familiar. So you're constantly chasing. And as I say, this is about neuroscience. This is literally like how your brain triggers endorphin release. So play, exploration of new familiar things sort of unfamiliar things but not too unfamiliar things, is literally how we are hardwired to get pleasure. That's why what we do in this industry is really important. It's one of the reasons why what we do in this industry is really important. And so we've got a mix of people here, right? So who's been in a classroom as an educator and seen those three faces at different times? Who's been in a classroom as a learner and had pulled one of or all of these faces at different times, right? Exactly. The thing around it is that what we want to do as designers is learn how to design things that keep people in that sweet spot. If I was to do a talk one-on-one with people, I could adjust to that really easily. At the moment, I'm talking to a room full of people, so trying to keep as many of you in that sweet spot is the challenge. When you're making a game that you're just going to release in the wild, partly that a whole bunch of people are just going to go, nah, and that's fine, you're self-selecting. But when they get in and they play, keeping them in that sweet spot is the interesting bit. So we're here for a games conference, we're also here for an experimental games conference. And that's where that field of experimental games is really important, because it allows us to test new things that push that thing around familiarity. And within the kind of academic field of experimental games, you can push it without necessarily having to try and keep people there. You can kind of go, yep, tried it, yeah. So one of those two ends didn't work at all. But you're experimenting, you're testing, you're playing with it. And that's really what we're kind of here to see. So when you look at the different things that people make, when you make experimental games, think around that space. Think like you're helping come up with new ideas to try and help others keep people in that sweet spot. As I said, I'm also really passionate about education. I talk about the 3 T's of learning a lot, the 3 T's of education: teaching, training, and testing. So I can tell you about some lovely theories, I teach them to you, and then I get you to do them in tutorials, you train. And then I test you in that afterwards with essays or exams. And none of those 3 things necessarily cause what I really want in the education space, which is transformation. I want to transform your attitudes and behaviors towards content, so that when it comes to you actually doing things like doing game design, you're actually going to use the things that you were taught, rather than just fall back to the really kind of habitual, ways you did stuff before. And more importantly, we've all been taught how to do a good password. We're all trained in how to do a password. We're all tested in doing passwords, and I still occasionally I'm like, yep, oh God, okay, I can't use that character, right? And yet for most people, when you're buying a present for a niece or nephew from a website that you're never going to get back to, but you want to create an account because you want to track to see whether it's going to arrive, most people will use the same throwaway password they use everywhere else. Because the core attitudes and behaviors towards password security aren't transformed by teaching, training, or testing. Transformation comes from safely experiencing the consequences of failure. You want to see what happens if you don't do it right. And that, again, is what games and play allows us to do. Speaking of the consequences of failure, anybody had any thoughts about this? Just as a reminder, so you've got this string MI, 4 rules, trying to get to the string MU. Got a few people who are like, oh yeah, that.
With rule 2, if it's MIU, it becomes MIUIU.
Yes, that's right. It doubles the whole thing. Whatever's there gets doubled. Correct. Clarifying questions. Beautiful. Engagement. Yeah. And then giving up. But that's fine. No, hasn't given up. Hasn't given up. He's just like, no, I haven't seen. He's like, I haven't got the answer yet. Which is what I want, right? So at Audacious, what we really focus on is this engagement. How do you engage people? And what we're really focused on around that is role play. What we really want to do is kind of say, we want to make things that people can kind of engage in role play around things. We actually made an app called Ardent Roleplay, which is a augmented reality app for tabletop role-playing games. So it brings augmented reality models to D&D, Call of Cthulhu, things like that. But we actually made it because of a bigger interest in education. And in fact, what we really actually work towards is interdisciplinary scenario-based role play. So who remembers their first kind of lesson in life? I'm hoping not to see any hands, because the first lessons we learn is when we're like tiny kids, right? The first way we learn, and still the best way we learn, well, the best way we learn is from experience, failure. But the second best way is in role play. It's when we play stuff out, explore it, and kind of get into it. If you're doing role play with larger groups, there's a couple of problems around it. One is you've got to really try and make it immersive, which can be kind of boring, or it's hard when it's a boring topic per se. Particularly if you're just doing like, here's a scenario text. Now imagine you're these people. And also for people who can't visualize, over there, aphantasia, and that wasn't in any way a bad thing. He's acknowledged that when I taught. And then the other one is the information mechanic. In role play, you want to make believe. You want to make believe that you're going to do something different. You don't want to have to make believe that you didn't hear the game master or facilitator tell someone else information that you shouldn't know. So managing who knows what in role play is really important. And again, so bring it back. This is not exactly an ad. This is just me telling you about how we do stuff. But so we've taken the augmented reality app and we're starting to roll it out in an education context in the same way, where you can then run like tutorial groups into scenarios. They can then look at, well, I can show you, they can look at 3D models, just phone-based, so we've got a headset support as well, and you can then show different things. I've got a short video, and we're nearly
the
there.
Audacious platform, we can show augmented reality models, marker-based, which allows people to really manage where they see it. They can move the marker around to explore, or they can move the phone device out to explore. We also have headset support for HoloLens 2 until 5. If we look at what's happening from the camera view, from the phone view, so seeing a model, exploring it from that perspective, looking at the phone, looking around. What it allows us to do then is to show different views on that model. So we can go inside, say a warehouse situation in this case, let people explore and familiarise themselves with. They can pinch zoom in, pinch zoom out. And as a facilitator, we can then show different issues, like for example, if there might be training around clutter and how the space is set up, or even showing more subtle things that people need to discover. So for example, in this instance, there's suddenly some smoke coming from behind the forklift, so they might want to have a look around, need to actually explore and see what the issue is. So as you can see, we can have nice animations and particle effects as well. We can employ that up to larger things, like there might be a material containment issue, and they need to work out the full evacuation procedures, exits, etc. for that location. Top of locations, we can also use.
I'll leave it at that for now. I'm just going to go there. I'll get to that bit in a moment. So the video goes on for a bit. It was obviously wasn't just made for this. So it's really tabletop AR, but we've got a version that sort of hovers in front of a screen. If you look at the screen, and then it sits in front, which is super cool. But it allows you to show things. So we've got a training partner who just used it with Chinese University Hong Kong to visualize airflow in biomanufacturing clean rooms, where if air flows over your head, it's already contaminated, so you might as well stop working what you're working on. So effectively, what these techs allow you to do is visualize things that are hard to visualize. Might be because of scale or because it's, air, hard to visualize air. Or as Josh said in that earlier talk, when you're kind of looking with a VR, AR, is when you can look at equipment that might be really dangerous, like working on electricity lines, or might be really expensive. We're making a scenario at the moment of like bioreactors, that are $100,000 each, and getting a room of biology students working on those is not what you want in undergrad necessarily. And I think as Hui said in that opening talk today, that consequences are just so important. People learn from failure; they learn from that. So that's what we kind of facilitate in those. And I think it's like, as the others said, the work integrated learning, the exhibitions, the physicality, all these things are great. And it just allows people to kind of engage and interact and see things more. And obviously when you've got project-based learning, that's fantastic. And sometimes you just want some prep towards that as well. But with all of that as well, the way that we approach it is that it's not a fully designed simulation system where you need to work out all the scenarios. It's a facilitator-led system that's really simple, where you can basically go, here's different states, including where things blow up or catch fire. And then as a facilitator, I can run different groups through different scenarios, disrupt them in interesting ways, and then see how they respond. And particularly, I think this is getting close to almost the last slide, large language models are here. Students are using ChatGPT. If there are students in the room, don't have to admit, what the hell, who's, no, don't. Yeah, see, there was a lovely article, I think it was in The Guardian the other day, where they basically said, all year we've talked to educators and lecturers, but nobody actually ever asked students, so we did a survey, and then they talked to a whole bunch of students, and they're like, oh yeah, and you read the article and it starts off and you think, oh, they're not using it, because they're like, oh look, if you want to get a good mark, you don't really want to use ChatGPT, blah, blah, blah. But geez, it makes short work of homework.
Yeah.
And you're like, yep, yeah, okay. So when you use role play in an education perspective, when you bring that play in, it creates a much deeper understanding. And previously, from a startup perspective, we talk about things being vitamins or painkillers. Right? Is your project a painkiller that's necessary, or a vitamin that makes things better? Role play makes things better. It's not a painkiller. We've got ways of teaching and testing things already. But if you use group-specific scenarios, and you can basically say, well, that group, this thing's going to go wrong, and that group, something else is going to go wrong, then your ChatGPT or your large language models won't know the content, and they can't just get the labs, write up done by computer, because, well, if they want to write everything in that happened to ChatGPT so I can write up the thing, then I'm like, yeah, sure, by that point you've written up everything anyway, so I don't care whether you're using ChatGPT as a fancy formatting, editing tool, whatever, but you've just got to do that base work. But underneath it all is the idea that engaging with things, experimenting, exploring, and then the reflection ideally that goes with that demonstrates that understanding. And role play, that I know we've done this with the Master of Psychology program at UQ, we've done it with town planning students, where we run large role plays of up to 60 students. It engages them and they stay engaged for that period. It keeps you on that high end of that curve that neuroscience tells us about. So that's a little bit of what we do at Audacious. We do other stuff as well. So I'm Ralf, and I should, anybody go with there? No. So when you approach this puzzle, you can do it in kind of two ways. One is you can just start writing out lots of things, the very practical applied way, or you can approach it from a very kind of formal modeling way, right? Mathematical model. As I said before, if you're not familiar with these kinds of problems, it's going to be a really, that no part of the curve. If you know the answer already, then you're like, yeah, whatever, it's boring. If you like those kinds of things, then you can kind of stay up here. The answer, by the way, is no. No, you cannot produce the string mu. Yeah. So the other interesting thing about that is that even when you're kind of engaging in questions and engaging in reality and engaging in puzzles, sometimes it just doesn't work that way, right? And sometimes it's really great to put challenges and things forward to people to go, here's a thing, right? Here's this experimental game idea I've got. And I'm going to test it.
The second condition has an exploit where if you do replace the M with the second character, both conditions are true after the second pass. So even though you might make it have two of the same character, the second one is still true that it will have one, but it also has two, which means you could get rid of the 3 I's and make it MU.
But you can't get to 3 I's. Because the second one doubles every time. So you go MI, MII, and then it's 4 I's. And it's just doubling. The X becomes XX, that's always just doubling.
But it's also 1 I and 2 I and 3 I.
No. Well, interpretation. So welcome to Legal 101. It depends on how you interpret it, but in formal logic you wouldn't interpret it that way. So yes, that's what we're doing. We're kind of looking at experimental reality, like extended reality, augmented reality, and that's some of the fun stuff we're doing.
Thanks, Ralf. Ross, want to run some questions and
And that's what.
Yeah, I mean,
ask about how you got into this, I guess.
I don't need this. You can all hear me because I've got quite a loud
They might need
voice.
it.
Oh yeah, well you'll need it. Are there any questions for Ralf? I've got a question.
Yeah, cool.
So you're a programming teacher, really, a science guy initially. How did you decide to form a games company? I've got this chair for you too.
Oh, cool.
Yes. Yeah, take a seat. Yeah. You've got one, haven't
Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, that's right. Hey, look, I just got a chair at Griffith.
you? Well done.
It's a professorship joke. Terrible, isn't it? I always like the students who laugh at your jokes always get better marks.
That's how to get the salad.
Yeah. Just that's the secret that Justin doesn't tell people.
Yeah, like
Yeah, it was so. As I said, my interest was in sort of how we make complex problems better and distributed systems integration, all these fun things. But I was actually much more interested always in how this stuff gets applied, rather than the theory of it. I would much rather work on put in a commercial grant application rather than a research grant application. I'd much rather talk with a company for 6 months and work out something than work on a grant application for 6 months and then put it into that 15% lottery that is research funding. And then ultimately kind of went away and worked in industry for a while and then got drawn back into teaching and then went away and got drawn back. But
are you a D&D nut as well?
I do like playing Dungeons and Dragons, yes, and Call of Cthulhu and Star Trek Adventures and a whole bunch of things. Oh, there's a question over there as well. You can ask as well. Yeah.
What's the solution to that problem?
The solution is literally it can't be solved.
There's no solution. Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell you. Sure, you can look at it, but I'll tell you where you went wrong later.
I'm learning failure.
Exactly.
Any other questions, Ralf?
I think the other. So I started looking at database design and then distributed database design and then business process engineering. And then from business process engineering, I went into ad hoc collaboration systems. And then somewhere along there, I was teaching game design because the game designer lecturer left and I had to fill in because I was running the program. And then I was doing research in affective computing, which is where you map out an emotional narrative for the user, and then you track how much you think they're aligned to that emotional narrative. For example, if they're supposed to be scared in a horror game, if they're really scared, their performance should be worsened. So you can kind of track through certain indicators, and then you adjust the system itself to try and scare them more if they're not, or scare them less if they are. And then from there I kind of left, and then that was an example of working with someone who then UQ approached us and said, hey, we want to apply some of this stuff in the psychology program around serious games. And we worked with them, and it was just really fascinating. And I'd done a grad cert in education and things in the past, and that was probably the big, how it kind of drew me into there. And then
Last time I saw you though, you were working on almost real dragons.
yes, that was the RPG stuff. Yeah.
And I've noticed,
Now we're working on a digital card game
Yeah.
for a company and doing other stuff. So the joys of game studios, which you'll hear more about in just a moment.
yeah. But I did think that like D&D is just about to turn
50.
Turn 50, but at the same time they're putting stuff in about if you make $750,000, you've got to start paying them some of their money, and then they've also turning into your digital. They've got the where you can start turning it into a virtual game, and they're going to own all the assets, and it all ties in.
So none of our stuff is actual
Yeah.
D&D
Yeah.
under the D&D, even under the open
You could apply
OGL.
it
Well, you could, but you
Yeah.
wouldn't, because
to. Yeah.
Hasbro are kind of a bit
Scary.
problematic. But you can be totally beautifully orthogonal to that.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you so much for your
No
time.
worries,
Really
yeah.
appreciate it.